Good morning, church. There we go. Talofa. My name's Josh. I'm an intern here, if you don't know me. And before the kids run off and get entirely distracted, I have a little activity. Can I get a couple of volunteers, small volunteers or larger volunteers? Anybody want to come up? I have a bowl of table tennis balls. How many table tennis balls can you hold at the same time? Do you have a guess? Do you have a guess? Can you hold one? Can you hold two? What about five? Okay, let's give it a go. All right, how many do you think? 5? Okay, let's see. 3? 4, 5? Okay, how many? 6, 7? Wee, 7? 8? 9? Oh, that's a lot of table tennis balls. Oh, 9. Very good, very good. Okay, back in the ball, back in the ball. Excellent. What about you? You're a little younger, a little smaller. How many can you hold? 1, 2?
3, 4, 5, 6.
Six. 6 is a lot of table tennis balls. Thanks for all of my volunteers. Very good. We'll get to the relevance of table tennis balls a little later. As a church, we've been in, we just came out of an Easter series, a Lent series, and then we had the last week, which is a baptismal week. Lent is about remembering Jesus and remembering the things that he did and leading up to that period and having a reflective time in that regard. And baptism is about demonstrating openly, having a moment of declaration about your faith publicly. We also had communion last week, which is, again, a memory activity reminding us of what God is doing, reminding us of who God was and his whole activity. Today's passage, when we get to it in a second, is a remember about this passage. But before we do, we're in Corinthians, and I'm going to do a little context. Corinth was a city in the Greek area of the Roman Empire. It had been destroyed some years previous and rebuilt by Romans and repopulated by Romans. It was essentially a Roman city in a Greek environment. But it was on an isthmus, so that's a skinny body of land in between two larger bodies, kind of like Auckland, between Northland and North Island. So a small, skinny bit. And because of that, it was a great trading port. Right? Great place for people to come from inland, load their stuff onto a ship, and ship it to Rome across a relatively straightforward sea. That made it wealthy. All right? It was wealthy, it was Roman, and some of those things meant that there was a lot of ritual, a lot of ceremony, a lot of religious ceremony. In fact, it was actually had some really dramatic religious ceremony. You guys heard of the Olympics? All right, they started in Greece. They started in Mount Olympus. And so they were the Olympic Games. Well, the Corinthians had something called the Isthmus Games, where everybody would come together every 2 years and have something very similar to the Olympics. A little smaller, a little more often, but people gathering together to do a whole lot of ceremonies and events in the name of the Greek and Roman gods. So in Corinth, the gods were a big deal. The lower G, not Christian gods were a big deal. And it was a problem in the church. So the Corinthians wrote to Paul asking for his advice, for his leadership on a whole variety of issues. We don't know exactly what they asked, but Paul talks about idolatry and worship quite a lot in Corinthians. And in the midst of some of these conversations and instructions that he's got, we have our passage today. I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 to 13, if you've got your Bibles. I will have it up on the screen. I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not become idolaters, as some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. We must not engage in immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. And we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. And do not complain, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide a way out, so that you may be able to endure it. At the beginning of the passage, Paul uses the word all quite a lot. All of them ate the same spiritual food. All of them were baptized. And all drank the same spiritual drink. All of them came through the Red Sea. These sacraments, these things to remember, these salvation acts, God's faithfulness in those places was for all of them. This is in contrast to later on where he goes to some. If we go to verse 5, most, verse 7, some, verse 8, some, verse 9, some. All right? All of the good things were for everybody. God did them for everybody regardless. And then some chose another path multiple times. All right? All of them were introduced to Moses' teaching, to Jesus through Moses' teaching, to the kingdom of God, to a new community, to a new way of living through Moses' teaching. And some chose to betray regardless. I'm just going to highlight a little bit from verse 7. This is a quote from Exodus. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. This is the part of Exodus where not long before this part, God asked all of the Israelites, "Hey, do you want to be part of do you want to be my people and I'll be your God? Do you want to commit to this relationship? Do you want to have it on an ongoing basis?" What did the people say? "We will." They all said it. It was just about unanimous. Everybody was like, "Yeah, we want to be your people. We want to be your God." and I'll be your God, says God. And then they start building the tabernacle so God can dwell among them in a physical manifestation, so that God's Spirit can be experienced through the cloud at all times. And then Moses heads up the mountain to get the commands from God, the laws. He's gone for 40 days. What happens? They start complaining right away. They're uncomfortable with waiting. They're uncomfortable with Moses not being there. They're comfortable at the bottom of this great big mountain they've been provided for. And they feel content to choose their own way. Choose a way that they had before. Have an image of a God that they think is in their control. Have an idol. This story, this verse 7, is about the golden calf and how they respond to the golden calf, right? They throw a party to do what they want into their control, not under God's command. And they rose up to play. Paul's writing to people who had some teaching. There would have been Jews there. There were definitely people teaching Christianity in Corinth. It's one of the points he mentions at different points in Corinthians. They would have known this story. One of the things that my Pentateuch lecturer pointed out when we were studying Exodus, so Pentateuch being the first 5 books, Exodus being the second book, one of the things he highlighted was that when the Israelites were to tell the story of the Exodus and the Passover in particular, they were to say to their children, that was me, I was there, God saved me. God's Spirit passed over my house, we were saved, I was saved. This is our story, this is our people. Exodus is a formative story for the people of God before Jesus. And the church in Corinth and around the Greek areas and the world is forming at this time in their story. And the narrative here is that God saved them and God was faithful to them consistently throughout that whole story. But they still strayed. So like they were remembering that story and people straying, we remember communion, we remember baptism, we remember Easter. We remember that we are saved through those sacraments. We announce that we are saved. It's an active participation. Yes, and so these things are symbols of that salvation, and these rememberings are symbols of that salvation. But at the height of this new kingdom, new people of God, salvation, good news, all of this, we have people walking away. And isn't life a bit like that? Everything is on the uptick. Everything is positive. We're trusting God. We're depending on God. He's doing everything. That's the story of Exodus. God provides the food. God provides the cloud to tell them where to go. God provides the water from a rock. But as soon as they have a little free time, they make different choices. As soon as they have an opportunity to complain, to test God, to be unfaithful, they do. I think our lives are a little bit like that too. God's demonstrated his strength, but we choose sometimes to stand on our own 2 feet. Thinking about baptism, we discussed it at our small group on Thursday, and on further reflection, I was thinking about my own baptism. It came up a little bit in the conversation, but I went a little further. When I was baptized, I was at a spiritual high, I described it as. I was trusting God, things were going well. I was in Ethiopia, where I grew up as a missionary kid. I wasn't I didn't fit in particularly well. I was never particularly good at school. The school I went to was considered to have the highest standard of education in the country. So I was going to school with the children of wealthy NGOs, the sons and daughters of diplomats' kids. In order to work in Ethiopia, you had to have at least a master's if you were a missionary. And so everybody was highly educated, really well off, doing really well, and I was bad at school. What's more, I was short. Hard to believe. I probably grew 20 centimeters in 1 year at one point, and I was amongst the shortest, and then not too long later, I was amongst the tallest. And this was all around the time that I got baptized. But I was still, one of the things that I always remember is that I was trying really hard to depend on God during a season. I was really leaning in and be like, okay, well, life's not good. I don't like it, feeling uncomfortable. But God's good. Trust God. Listen, and stuff will turn around a little bit. And it did. Stuff started going well. What do you think happened? I got distracted. I was like, oh, wow, I grew 20 centimeters. I can now compete on the sports field. I finally started doing well in school, so I slacked off a little more. Right? I got distracted. I took my eyes off. I stopped depending on God. Is that working? Very good. This is a bit like what life is like, I think. And if you'd asked me, I would have still said, oh, yes, I believe in God. I still trust in God. I was baptized. I don't think I needed to be baptized again. But I slacked off and I forgot. I got distracted. I put other things first. These verses in Corinthians are about God's faithfulness and our forgetfulness, our lack. In the context of Corinthians, he's talking about idolatry, right? He's talking about things done for other gods, other purposes, or yourself rather than for God. Failure to worship as they've been commanded, failure to remember, failure to trust God who had been obvious, taking care of them every day, and they still opted to forget, to not trust, to go their own way. And Paul says that's what these verses are about. A reminder to be faithful as God is faithful. These things happen to them to serve as an example. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us as the end of the age comes. The Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, is there for our teaching and to remind us sometimes when we stray that God is still faithful, right? God still did those things for us, and we need to stay faithful and dependent. I really think verse 12 can be a good spiritual practice. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. We are saved by Christ, for Christ, with Christ. If you think you are doing well on your own, check yourself. Are you standing on your own 2 feet? Do you think you're standing on your own 2 feet and you're not? The Corinthians were wealthy, well-off, competitive people who were standing on their own 2 feet. They'd been planted there by Rome, but they were making their own money, and they had their own way. And they had their own way for a good amount of time. And they thought, hey, I can do this on my own. And it was a challenge for the church. They didn't do things God's way. They were doing things their way. And so Paul is saying, hey, check yourself. He's not calling them out individually. We don't have you in particular. We have some. In the context of God's providence for all, we have some who choose to go astray. Some who choose not to partake in the rituals of our celebration equally. Some who choose to have more rather than to depend more. But we all need Christ, and we all need to be reminded that we need Christ. Just as it was important for the Corinthians to remember that, it's important for us to remember that. It's really easy in New Zealand today, right? I'm dependent on my wife because I'm a student. And sometimes I want a new basketball. Sometimes I want a new pair of shoes, or I want to go hang out with mates in an evening. Guess who has to pay? I am dependent on my wife to pay. It's good. It's good, but I need to remember that whenever I'm making these decisions and consult her. Much the same in our life. We need to remember to constantly be dependent. But that is overwhelming, right? My life is out of my control. I can't have what I want when I want it. What's more, there's things that I have to do because I'm trying to be obedient to God, and it feels like too much. I feel like I have too many things that I want to contribute to or that God's asking for me to do, and it's just hard and unpleasant sometimes, right? I have to give up this. I have to depend in that place. Is that relatable? Life is overwhelming. Life is overwhelming, and you have to check yourself so that you're depending on God in it. Luckily, we have verse 13. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. In the Exodus story, some did this and some did that. And we all had those temptations. All had, all have. Right? God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. Table tennis balls, small hands. You know what's better than small hands for holding table tennis balls? Bowl. There's a way out. The bowl's pretty good for holding table tennis balls. We feel like we're holding all of this stuff. We're really juggling all of the different things in our lives that if we don't do this well or we don't do that well, life's going to collapse and we're going to drop 9 table tennis balls all over the floor. Put them back in the bowl. Depend on God. God is faithful, and we are faithful. He has not given us too much. All right? So remember to check yourself so that you're depending on God and not holding all the things. And God will provide a way out. Lord, I want to thank you for your word. I want to thank you for the convictions that we can have about life, about what we must do, about what you're asking us to do. I want to thank you for the many things that we are able to do in your power. I want to thank you that we have public declarations of your will and your word and what you've done for us. Baptism, Lent, Easter celebrations, communion, and that we have stories that remind us of your faithfulness and your greatness throughout our history, throughout the churches and the community of God's history. Help us to remember that you've got bigger hands than us and to not hold too much, but to be faithful and dependent. Amen.